Recently, I've been playing a lot of Soulsborne games. After playing and reviewing Bleak Faith, I followed it up with Bloodborne. While I enjoyed my time with them, I soon realized I was craving something slower, if not more relaxed. That's when I came across Labyrinth of the Demon King, a game often praised as a spiritual echo of another From Software classic, King's Field. For those unfamiliar, King's Field was a series that predated the Souls games and laid much of the groundwork for what later made FromSoft famous worldwide. These titles and others in their mold were marked by the same Souls-like vibe in their world building. Mysterious, atmospheric environments, stories that aren't handed up to you outright, but instead uncovered piece by piece. Combat that's slow, deliberate, and deeply resource-dependent. Every engagement felt calculated, every step forward tinged with risk. Labyrinth of the Demon King promised exactly that experience. King's Field infused with the unsettling tone of Silent Hill. What drew me in immediately was its unique setting and premise. You play as an Ashigaru, a foot soldier in feudal Japan, whose master has been slain by a demon king. Bound by loyalty and vengeance, you enter the Demon King's domain, a labyrinth of monsters, traps, and puzzles, pressing ever deeper until you can finally confront him in battle. From the very first moment you step into the game, standing beside what is meant to be your field camp before heading down a fog-shrouded forest path, it's immediately clear what Labyrinth of the Demon King is aiming for. The clunky, almost tank-like controls aren't accidental, they're deliberately designed to enhance that intended experience. While you can sprint, dodge, and jump, your character still feels slow and rather heavy. Every action is bound to your stamina bar, which forces you to approach combat cautiously and deliberately. We'll talk more about this later. The presentation, both visuals and music, is equally unmistakable. A grainy film filter overlays everything, accompanied by eerie soundscapes that reinforce the sense of unease. The game is clearly trying to conjure an experience rather than just a system of mechanics, and for me at least, it succeeds in making the atmosphere the central selling point. The feudal Japan setting, the samurai aesthetic, the weapons, even the way you heal with sake or tea, everything is tailored to reflect this premise. Unfortunately, Labyrinth of the Demon King quickly becomes one of those games where atmosphere cannot fully survive the gameplay. In horror titles, or really any game where atmosphere is meant to take precedence, the gameplay must support and reinforce the mood, not contradict it with clunky or tedious mechanics. Sadly, Labyrinth commits this sin repeatedly. One might think the obvious comparison here is to King's Field or Silent Hill, but I found myself thinking instead of Manhunt. To be clear, these games are vastly different in premise, structure, and gameplay loop, yet what makes the comparison worthwhile is how each handles the delicate balance between atmosphere and gameplay. Manhunt rarely shattered the grim fantasy it was creating, because the atmosphere consistently carried the experience. For those unfamiliar, the game casts you as a death row inmate forced into a sadistic snuff film production where survival requires brutal violence against waves of gang members and criminals. Whatever its flaws, Manhunt was praised for how it never let tedium break the illusion. The brutality was relentless, but the fantasy stayed intact. By contrast, in Labyrinth of the Demon King, I often felt myself pulled out of its otherwise compelling and atmospheric premise by the sheer tediousness of its gameplay loop. The aesthetic, the setting, the tone, it's all there, but the structure of play works against it, turning what could have been a haunting journey into something far more frustrating. The graphics are unapologetically PS1 inspired, and I find that design choice both deliberate and charming. The default film grain filter seems intended to reinforce the retro aesthetic, and it works. Environments, monsters, and NPCs are all visually distinctive enough to be unsettling or recognizable, while the lo-fi style leaves just enough space for the player's imagination to fill in the blanks. A quality especially important in horror games. One small but impressive detail is that you can actually see your character's body and armor when you look down. It's a minor touch, but it adds a surprising amount to immersion, grounding you more fully in the game world. The sound design combines unsettling dark ambient textures with what I believe to be traditional Japanese music. It isn't particularly memorable on its own, but it serves the atmosphere well. The monster audio, however, is much stronger. Their sounds are sufficiently eerie, effectively conveying the madness of traversing the Demon King's labyrinth, and keeping you on edge whenever you hear them echoing through the halls. Although I'll discuss combat more fully in the next section, I should note here that it feels visceral and weighty. Dismemberments and decapitations don't just look impactful, they enhance the atmosphere by reminding you of the brutality lurking beneath every encounter. Finally, the presentation is elevated by some excellent cutscenes, which punctuate key moments and boss fights. They're cinematic, stylish, and add considerably to the game's atmosphere, making progression feel more rewarding. Since Labyrinth of the Demon King was only released this year, I'll try to avoid major spoilers. What I can say is that the game begins at a deliberately slow pace, and this actually works in its favor. The measured, atmospheric opening sets the tone perfectly. Your journey gradually leads you towards the Demon King's domain. This progression is wonderfully executed. A tense descent through a cave, an unexpected climb up through a well, and finally the emergence into a desolate Japanese castle. The atmosphere here is exceptional. The sense of mystery, the eerie quiet, the looming danger of the Demon King's lair, and the uncertainty of what might be waiting beyond every corner. This opening act may very well be the strongest phase of the entire game, both in terms of atmosphere and setup. It captures exactly the kind of dread and anticipation that the premise promises. The enemy design, once you actually meet them, immediately gave me a yummy, well, from Dominion's vibe, which isn't surprising given the Japanese setting. Many of the monsters feel rooted in Japanese mythology, and while I'm not someone who is easily frightened by games, their design, combined with the eerie audio work, was unsettling enough to leave an impression. The problem, therefore, lies not in their look or feel, but in how progression with these enemies is structured. The labyrinth is divided into sections or towers, each further broken into floors. Moving between them requires a loading screen, and every transition almost always results in enemy respawns. I call them semi-random because while you will always encounter the same types of enemies in an area, I could not determine whether their numbers were fixed. The result of this design? Well, you can never truly clear an area. That alone isn't inherently bad. I enjoy games like Diablo or Grim Dawn where clearing zones feels satisfying. On the other hand, I've never been a fan of design choices like the one in Sacred where enemies respawn endlessly. But all of those games are ARPGs and the design premise is entirely different. Here, in a slower, atmosphere-driven game, the constant respawning quickly becomes obnoxious. Don't get me wrong, I understand why it's done. Respawns are meant to keep backtracking dangerous and force you to spend resources. But the frequency kills the tension. Fewer respawns, or perhaps respawning triggered every 2 or 3 transitions instead of every single one, would preserve danger while preventing monotony. As it stands now, you quickly learn to expect combat on every floor change, which drains encounters of suspense. The developers attempt to soften this by making monsters frequently in fight. While that reinforces the intended atmosphere of madness, it often ends up comic rather than frightening. What is even worse, the deliberately clunky combat system makes running away feel more rewarding than actually fighting. When evasion is consistently the better option, the game undermines its own premise of slow, deliberate, and dangerous combat. I think that this is a poorly thought out choice that wears out both the combat and the horror really fast. All the great atmosphere the game has been building is undermined by this design choice. Another almost fatal design choice, and this involves a minor spoiler, is an NPC quest that feels essentially unavoidable. To keep things a bit vague, you're asked by an NPC to deliver an item, and in exchange he will give you a key you need for progression. I've read that some players tried killing the NPC to bypass the quest, but I haven't seen anyone actually succeed. I guess this really makes the mission unavoidable. Completing this mission triggers the appearance of a monster that relentlessly chases you through the labyrinth. At first, this is a cool idea. In practice, it quickly becomes one of the game's most frustrating mechanics. As I've said, the monster is unkillable, meaning you spend the majority of the game running from it. And while it's easy to escape, it's also hard to truly avoid it. It spawns in your face, follows you endlessly, and even ends up breaking immersion. You can even game the system by luring it into fights with other monsters, turning what should be a terrifying stalker into an accidental ally. Unlike the elegant cat-and-mouse tension of Amnesia or Alien Isolation, this isn't atmospheric horror. It's an annoying chase sequence on repeat. Worse, it severely limits your ability to explore. In a game that relies on atmosphere and hidden secrets, having a constant pursuer forces you to rush through rooms you'd otherwise linger in. The frequent respawns I criticized earlier are at least manageable, since you can clear an area temporarily. This monster, on the other hand, removes even that fragile sense of control. I understand the design intention, it's meant to apply pressure and keep you on edge, but the execution is poor. The mechanic overstays its welcome, and the option to permanently deal with the monster comes far too late in the game. A better approach would have been to allow the player to either banish it temporarily, perhaps by dealing enough damage, or unlock an earlier quest to resolve it permanently. This way the resolution, because eventually you get a way to permanently banish him, comes way too late. As it stands, the implementation undercuts the atmosphere and becomes a constant annoyance. The infamous Pursuer from Dark Souls 2 is a mild inconvenience compared to this guy. The combat design doesn't do the game any favors either. Don't get me wrong, the slower pace, stamina-based system is fine on paper, and I generally enjoy that style. But with the constant respawns and the ever-present stalker, the novelty wears thin very quickly. Combat actually revolves around a careful balance of attacking, blocking and dodging. You get one free dodge every few seconds, provided you have the stamina available, dodge again before the cooldown ends, and it will consume stamina. In practice, I found the most reliable strategies were either blocking and counter-attacking, or hitting an enemy, sprinting away to recover stamina, since sprinting doesn't drain stamina but only limits recovery, and then charging back in with a heavy attack. You also have a Dark Messiah of Might and Magic style like kick, only less effective since it does not really knock down enemies but is mostly used to gain some space or break the enemy block. Supplies are limited to what you can carry, sake or tea for health and a few items for stamina restoration. Using them is as straightforward as pressing a button, there are no animations, delays or risks involved, which makes recovery feel functional but kinda bland. The result is a system that feels challenging at first, but quickly becomes predictable and easy. Once you realize how exploitable enemy behavior is, especially their tendency to infight after accidentally striking one another, combat loses much of its tension. Running away often proves more efficient than fighting, and since enemies frequently hit each other during a chase, you can reduce many encounters to little more than a chaotic slapstick.
Salty from the future here, because I totally forgot to mention one thing about the game. And well, now I'm just gonna make this quick note. The game also features a talisman system. Talismans can be best thought of as some sort of spells that you can use in certain situations. They don't really drain any resource, but you have to find them in-game. I found their use to be minor and, well, I didn't find them too useful, except one talisman that lets you teleport back to a certain hub area. These talismans range from doing a little bit of damage to removing poison to healing you a little bit. In any case, these are found in the game world, can be bought as well after a certain point, but don't really influence the gameplay too much.
What should be tense, deliberate combat instead becomes a repetitive loop, one that actively undermines both the atmosphere and the intended difficulty. The enemy variety is adequate, I suppose, for a game of this length and scope. What I did appreciate were the small lore snippets scattered throughout the world, many of which also serve as practical guides on how to handle certain foes. Alongside your standard demons, some armed, others attacking barehanded, you encounter mutated dog-like creatures that must be knocked down and finished with a stomp, or skeletons that can only be damaged with blunt weapons. The way different weapon types are required against different enemies is a nice touch and adds at least a little tactical depth. The core gameplay loop then consists of exploring the dungeon, hunting down puzzle components, solving them, and facing bosses to progress further. The boss fights, unfortunately, are underwhelming as well. They are introduced with stylish cutscenes and the visual design is often striking, but the encounters themselves are straightforward and surprisingly easy. As I mentioned in my Bloodborne review, bosses are rarely the highlight for me even in Souls games, but here they feel even less memorable. They exist more as a genre expectation than as a genuine peak of the experience. None stood out as particularly challenging, creative, or worth remembering once the fight was over. There are only a handful of NPCs you'll encounter during your journey. The most notable is a mysterious cat who assigns you missions and reappears at various points in the Labyrinth. Then there's the smith, who upgrades your weapons and armor using materials you've collected. Beyond these, you'll come across a few lesser NPCs, captives you can free, or characters who briefly cross your path. Of that group, the cat is arguably the most interesting, largely because of its recurring role and its connections with the smith and even certain monsters. Still, none of these NPCs are particularly memorable beyond their function. They serve their purpose, quest giver, upgrade vendor, occasionally world building element, but they don't offer much in terms of personality or narrative depth. Beyond the issues with respawns and the unkillable stalker, the most grating design choice, though admittedly more a genre staple than a unique flaw, is the sheer amount of backtracking. Make no mistake, you'll be doing a lot of it. Even if you follow a guide, the game forces you through the same areas repeatedly. Without one, the backtracking becomes almost endless. While I usually enjoy exploration, here it often feels like padding. The environments, for the most part, are narrow corridors dressed in the style of a Japanese castle. There are some striking departures, basement levels, outdoor sections, boss arenas, but for the majority of your playtime you'll be revisiting familiar territory again and again. Progress is tied to shrines, which serve as save points scattered across the levels. Dying simply respawns you at the last shrine you visited. There's no penalty for death. In fact, it almost feels like a reward since you come back with full health. This system feels uninspired, especially in a genre where death is usually central to tension and resource management. The developers had countless opportunities to make this more interesting. A system similar to Bloodvest's curse mechanic, for example, could have fit the lore and added real stakes to dying. Combined with the fact that sprinting past enemies is often the most viable tactic, and that even if you're caught, there's little consequence, the shrine system ends up undermining both the atmosphere and the challenge. Shrines also function as the game's level up system, though it's extremely rudimentary. Throughout the dungeon you'll find special items that allow you to increase either your stamina or your health. And that's it, no further character development, no branching stats, no builds to experiment with. The only other element of customization comes from weapon choice. There is a fair amount of weapon variety. Standard arms can be found, purchased, or occasionally assembled from rare components into unique weapons. Still, the upgrade system is just as bare bones as leveling. You collect upgrade materials in the dungeon and bring them to the smith, who uses them to improve your weapons and armor in a very linear fashion. There is also an item combination mechanic, but it's rarely used for creative crafting. Instead, it mainly serves as a way to piece together quest items needed to solve puzzles. Overall, character progression and upgrading feel more like functional checkboxes than meaningful systems, offering little room for experimentation or personal playstyle. The puzzles themselves range from very easy to somewhat obscure. They're not obnoxious, and usually you have a very good idea on what needs to be done due to the in-game notes, sometimes structured as poems. I found it funny that in one particular puzzle the solution was capitalized in the notes to make sure you don't have any chance of missing it. When I step back and objectively categorize the points I've mentioned so far as either positive or negative, the negative side is clearly heavier. At first glance, this might seem to contradict the fact that I ultimately enjoyed the game more than I disliked it. But when you dig into the details, the flaws naturally stand out more sharply than the strengths. I think Labyrinth of the Demon King deserves a neutral rating. While I did enjoy my time with it, I can't shake the sense that its systems are clunky, underdeveloped, and not fully carried through to their final implications. Combat at its core is fun, but there's simply too much of it, and the sheer repetition erodes the game's carefully built horror facade. Once that facade falls away, for all the reasons I've already discussed, what remains are gameplay mechanics that are serviceable at best and often subpar. The game is heavily carried by its atmosphere and unique setting. When that slips, it loses most of its charm. For that reason, I can recommend a playthrough, just not at full price, I would say. It's worth noting that an update with additional content is reportedly on the way, but this review was written before that release. I think the new update is sorely needed, as it seems to be adding New Game Plus, which the game really needs, as there is very little replay value to be had here right now. So, who is this game really for? I guess if you're into old school survival horror and King's Fields-like, yes, that's a thing now, you might find a lot of these things that scratch the itch here. Otherwise, there's an okay game for one playthrough, I guess. My main gripe with the game remains the same. It's a game that heavily relies on its setting and atmosphere, but allows the atmosphere to be undercut by the combat and encounter design, which is very unfortunate. I finished the game in around 8 hours, and it seems that it is much less than that if you truly know what you're doing, so the game is on the short side as well. In this case, perhaps that was for the best, because the repetitive combat was really dragging down the whole experience. I would recommend waiting for a discount and only get it at full price if the premise really does sound appealing enough to you, even with all its downsides. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. And I'll see you soon, somewhere very scary, very strange, and perhaps a little cultic.